Hi everyone, I'm Hanovi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator for Redwood Consulting, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwood is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to housing and homeless services, children and youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you're interested, you can contact me at hanovi@red-wind.net. That's HONOVI at red-wind.net. As this states, this project is supported by grant number 2018 TA AX-K003 and 2020 TA AX-K006, which was awarded by the Office of Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Presenting with us today are Mariacristina Pacheco and Victoria Ybanez. So Mariacristina is the Assistant Director of NOVA's Campus Training and Technical Assistance Program and has over 18 years of experience working to end gender-based violence through prevention and education efforts in the nonprofit sector and higher education settings. Victoria Ybanez developed and is the Executive Director of Redwood Consulting from 2005 to present day, and has been working to end violence against American Indian and Alaskan Native women for 35 years. She has the depth of experience working closely with tribes in developing and implementing a range of responses to violence against Indigenous women, has conducted numerous on-site visits, and has facilitated sessions and trainings for tribes over the past 20 years. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them into the chat box or click the hand icon and we'll be able to see this. Or if you have any issues with the presenter view getting or blocking any of the text, you are able to move that to any corner. And I will now turn it over to our presenters.
Thanks, Hanovi. Welcome, everybody. We're really happy that you could join us today. So I just want to tell you a little bit more about myself, and I'll turn it over to Mariacristina to do that as well. As Hanovi mentioned, I'm the Director of Redwood Consulting, and I've been doing National Tribal TA for the last 22 years through OVW. And in my work through National Tribal TA, as well as before I started doing training and technical assistance, I have worked on coordinated community response. I have participated in a CCR in the Duluth, Minnesota community, as well as I have facilitated CCRs and then have worked with CCRs with tribes as well as with non-Native organizations over the years. So I'm really looking forward to sharing a little bit about what I know with you, and I'll turn it over to Mariacristina.
Thank you, Vicky. My name is Mariacristina Pacheco, and I work at the National Organization for Victim Assistance. I'm very grateful to be here today with you all. I've been working, well, a little bit over 5 years as a technical assistance provider, but have been working almost over 15 years in coordinated community response based in community, but also based on campuses. And I've had the opportunity, being a partner, being a member, leading coordinated community responses. And it's been an interesting journey, to learn from the different groups and to continue to see how the coordinated community response evolves. And we'll try to share a little bit of that experience today.
Thanks, Mariacristina. Next slide. One more slide. So we want to talk about prevalence. Every time when we think about the work that we do, it's really important for us to understand what's going on and the reality that plays out. And so in this, while it covers broadly some information, I think it's important to understand that within our Native populations, we have really high prevalence rates. Prevalence for violence within our lifetimes, as well as prevalence with sexual violence. So when we look at this data here from the National Institute of Justice, we have more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women, 84.3% have experienced violence in their lifetime. So when we think about that 84.3%, and conversely, as we look at the second column, as we look at Native men, 81.6% have experienced violence in their lifetime. So that is literally, when we think about that, that's 1 in 5 that have not, or less than 1 in 5 that have not experienced violence. And as it shows here, more than 4 in 5 have. So anytime we think we're in a small group of people of, 5 people, 10 people, we could look and think, that just about everybody in that small group has experienced violence in their lifetime. So then when we look at it in terms of sexual violence, at the bottom bullets there, 56.1% of women have experienced sexual violence, and 27.5% of men have experienced sexual violence. So again, thinking about our small circles of people. So as we think about two women, oftentimes when we look at that usually 2 women standing there, we would expect that at least one of them, and maybe both of them, have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And then when we look at it in terms of men who have experienced sexual violence with our Native men, 27.5%, so less than a third of Native men, but that's still a significantly high population. And so when I think about this data, it's important for us to realize that it really gives us an understanding of why this work is so completely important for us to be doing. Next slide. So I just popped in the chat a link to the National Institute of Justice resource. It's a report that came out in 2016, which gives us the most recent prevalence data that we have within our Native communities. So when we think about a coordinated community response, that for me, I used to work in Duluth, Minnesota, and actually the concept of a coordinated community response was developed in Duluth, Minnesota back in the 80s. And it's an interagency effort to change the climate of tolerance for battering by institutionalizing practices and procedures which centralize victim safety and offender accountability in domestic assault related cases. And while this is referring to domestic violence, that's the way it was originally conceived. And as a result of the work over the years, since the 1980s, we have seen over and over again that a CCR model is really adaptable in so many different ways that we've seen it used in some way of looking at systemic problems around sexual assault. We've seen it in terms of the intersection of domestic violence and child maltreatment. We're seeing it in education settings as well as tribal college campuses. Next slide. And I'll turn it over to you, Maria, for this one, for this next slide.
Yes, thank you. So what we'll try today is to attempt to invite you to consider working on what a tribal campus coordinated community response would be. And in this setting and context, a coordinated community response team on a tribal institution would be an approach within the community and in the institutions, and we call them community partners, but the nearby locations and organizations that they get together to achieve a shared goal or vision that integrates multiple disciplines. So it is something that's a multifaceted approach that is inclusive of prevention, intervention, treatment, and response. So what we mean with this is that within a community or the system, there's leadership, there's direct service providers, there's different programs. In this context, it's to address violence against women. So it would include very specifically like rape crisis centers, domestic violence centers, safety, health providers. And all of these people just come together to work on some shared goals and objectives that will lead the community and that space to come together to address violence against women. But it's a holistic approach. It's not just a siloed approach. So what we want is to have this multidisciplinary team of partners who can meet and communicate on a regular basis to be able to plan, to identify what are the needs, to monitor what are the services that are being provided, to assess what are still some of the gaps in terms of the service provision, and then how can they enhance their prevention efforts, but also their response as that relates to their institution that they're based or that they're responding to. So we can go to the next slide now. And I think we're not necessarily in the right slide. We may need to go back one more, I think. No, I think to the next one.
Let's go to the slide with principles of intervention, slide 7. So when we think about principles of intervention, and thank you, Mariacristina, for describing about the work within campuses. So when I think about the work that we do within a CCR, one of the critical pieces in there is that we're affirming our relationship with the survivors. And as a part of that, in our work with our survivors, for us within our Indigenous communities, we talk about it as a relative-centered approach. So our survivors, we always remember that they are our relatives, and in the way that we work with survivors, that we operate recognizing that we are all related. And then another concept, a principle of intervention, is offender accountability. So as we look at a CCR, part of our role is how are we ensuring that offenders, people who are engaging in these acts of violence, are being held accountable for their violence. And then thirdly, that we're changing the climate of the community. And so the way I was taught this back several years ago was that we work to change the conditions in our community that allows this violence to exist. So through a coordinated community response, we are working through communication and cooperation to ensure that we're enhancing the safety of the survivors, affirming our relationship with those survivors through a relative-centered or trauma-informed approach, and we're ensuring that offenders are being held accountable for their violence and changing our societal conditions that allow the violence to exist. Would you like to add something, Maria?
No, that was great. I think it's a long-term effort to start modeling, that cultural shift and changing those social norms that allow violence to happen, and just working together to slowly but steady work towards changing that by also integrating everything that you said, and also modeling that collaboration and that trauma-informed and survivor-centered approach in terms of the effort and the response that the team provides.
Great. And for me, when I think about this, the principles of intervention, we all come to the table together. We sit and we work through to figure out what's happening and how can we do it in a most effective way so that we're working to enhance safety and hold offenders accountability and change that climate. And through that, then we have to learn how we're communicating with each other. And so one of the things I think about is that you set a group of practitioners together at the table, and we all have different focuses of our day-to-day job. And if we ask, what does safety mean to you? We're going to come up with variations of that definition. So as practitioners sitting together, working on this together, we have to come to a common understanding, a common language, and learn about each other's jobs. I know when I first started working on CCRs, I used to think and stop and think about how I wanted law enforcement to do things drastically different. And I actually felt frustrated because they weren't doing it drastically different. And the more I learned about their job, I started to realize that some of my requests were unreasonable because they didn't fit within the structures that they were required to work within. And the more I became informed about how they worked, then I was able to make requests that were more reasonable and had the possibility of being effective and successful because I had a better understanding of their structure. And I think that's true for each of us sitting around the table about having a better understanding of how we work, what are the rules, what is in place that guides us, where are the areas we have flexibility to maneuver, and where are the walls that are rigid, which actually makes for a more helpful and holistic relationship. Next slide. So I've been talking about the Duluth CCR, how that was developed there. So when we look at a Duluth model of a coordinated community response, that in its core, if we look at this graphic here, we can see in the center of it is the lived experiences of victims and survivors. And so through the work that we were doing in Duluth, we always talked about in that center, we needed to have somebody speaking on behalf of survivors and information that represented survivors in the way we approached that work. And often it was advocacy that brought that, but it wasn't exclusively advocacy. Sometimes it was assistance, victim specialists that was bringing some of that information. And other times we would engage in focus groups or different ways that we would be in discussion with survivors to learn from them about their experiences with different elements of the system. Other core practitioners beyond advocates include the prosecutors, law enforcement, jail, probation, and offender programs. And then as the CCR model has evolved, we've also started looking at courts, child protective systems, supervised visitation, and adult protective services, and an enhanced response team. So when I talk about an enhanced response team, so I live here in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and we had a domestic violence enhanced response team, which was called DIVERT. And that team would respond when any one of the practitioners in the CCR would see that there was a victim that had a higher level of potential risk for lethality. That enhanced response team would get involved and work with that survivor, and also working at enhancing the offender accountability and strategies to protect the safety of that survivor. And this comes from like more the original model of a CCR. So I just want to be really clear. This is a heavy focused criminal justice systems model. Next slide. So as we think about this from a CCR perspective, over the years of doing this work and within our tribal communities, we've talked about the CCR model and where does that come from. So I've been talking about how it was conceived in Duluth, Minnesota as a part of the criminal justice response there. But as we've been talking amongst Indigenous people and amongst our tribes, and specifically, I want to give a shout out to Marlon Musso, who is Oglala Lakota, and he and I were doing a CCR training, and we talked about what would an Indigenous CCR look like. And through that process, through that conversation that he and I had, we started identifying the Indigenous way that a coordinated community response was in place prior to colonization within our tribal communities. So collectively within our tribe, for the survival of our peoples, we had to work together, communicating and cooperating to ensure the safety and the well-being of all members of the tribal community. So through our brainstorming, and the reason I gave out a shout out to Marlon was he came up with most of this. So talking about that, the small and large game hunters were critical for the safety and well-being, the natural, the wood, natural foods, and the water gatherers, the spokespeople, the decision makers, the peacekeepers, were also responsible. So they would have been more likely the lawmakers within the tribe. The tokalas were the people, and this is in using Lakota language, they would take care of the elders, and that was their responsibility to ensure their safety and their well-being and protecting them through changes when the tribe was migrating or through the cold weathers as people had settled down for the winter. The healers, the medicine, and the wisdom keepers. So as we think about that we're basically talking about our medicines and spiritual well-being as a part of that. And then also our protectors of the boundaries and our internal communities as well. So this would be our law enforcement. And they were looking out for the safety of the well-being, the community as a whole, and specific emphasis toward the children and the elders within the community. And when we think about this particular model, we can take that and transpose that over a criminal justice coordinated community response and see that there's a lot of the same kind of thinking around that, and that collectively we work together to ensure that the well-being of everybody, and so that nobody is slipping through the cracks and being harmed and not being supported and treated as relatives in this work and effort. Next slide. So when we take that prior to colonization model and we bring it into current day as an Indigenous CCR model, we're going to follow a similar process of it to the Duluth model, but we also want to recognize that within our tribes, because of the different jurisdictional challenges we might have, that we may have different jurisdictional practitioners involved. So for instance, as we think about our tribal, state, and tribal, federal, and sometimes state law enforcement. So we would have our tribal law enforcement, of course. For sexual assault, we would have our federal partners that would be involved, which may be Bureau of Indian Affairs or FBI, depending on the tribe. And then depending on some of the tribes that are located in a public law 280 state, those of you will probably know who you are. In those instances, we will have state law enforcement, and it runs concurrent jurisdiction. And so then that carries forward to our prosecutors as well, of our tribal prosecutors, our federal through our US attorneys, and then our state, if it's a public law, 280 state. And then within our tribe, our offender programs, our probation courts, advocacy, and then again, a variation will be our cultural leaders. So as we looked at the prior to colonization and model, we looked at our healers and our medicine keepers and our spiritual peoples. And we would also consider that in here because that's going to be critical for our long-term healing. So we want to have our cultural leaders who are involved in our traditional medicines and our spiritual ways. And then also critically is our tribal leadership. So we know that within our tribes, that our tribal leadership, our tribal government works more closely with our programs, and our programs are often seated within our tribal governments. So our tribal leadership needs to be informed to keep in place the continued support and resources to do the work that we do. So we want to figure out a way to have our leadership involved, people from our tribal council, and not necessarily to be involved in the minutia of the work of the CCR, but involved in ways to support. So I always tell a CCR as they're developing to think about that, involve your leadership in times where you're going to stop and recognize your milestones and save the day-to-day for the practitioners working on that day-to-day. And so it might be quarterly or biannually that you bring tribal leadership involved in your CCR model, or you have somebody, maybe your tribal leader is also involved as one of the practitioners. So that would be perfect to have that combination of that leader there as well. But if the leader doesn't fit one of the other categories, they might not feel as useful to be involved in some of the minutia along the way. Next slide. And I'll turn this over to you, Mariacristina.
Thank you, Vicky. So now we would like to invite you all to share maybe in the chat, what are your thoughts about who should be involved within a tribal campus CCR team, and who are the key players of that process? So we will ask you to use Menti for this. And I see Hanabi is trying to help us set that up in the screen.
Sorry.
So for us to participate, we need to add a code. I don't know if we can share that in the chat box or.
So it's in the chat box now.
There you go. Thank you. If you click on that link, it will bring you to the Mentimeter, and you just answer your questions, which are all anonymous, and we'll take it from there. And we have a couple there, community members, students, leaders. We're just giving people a couple more seconds to see. Oh, do we have some more here? Community members, shelters, staff, safety, and health services providers. Okay. And if anyone is having a hard time using Mentimeter, feel free to also type here in the chat in Zoom and we can integrate that to the conversation. So for us, I think this is always a very institution-specific response, just because there's always a diversity in terms of the context where the institution is located, to really help us think like who should be part of that CCR team. So it could be that depending on where you are, you'll have a direct service provider in there, but maybe you don't have a direct service provider in your community, but you do have, you know, healers, other community leaders, survivors who have overcome their situation and are in a better place to support other survivors. It also may include faculty members. I always think it's very important to have students and survivors' voices because they will be the ones leading the work and telling us what are their specific needs and how to best respond to those needs. And also in terms of the campus structure, if you have like Title IX staff, if you have direct student services staff, it could be from you know, students affairs, administrative staff. All those people are important to be part of the CCR team because somehow they have a connection with students. So they should be able to provide students with any support or response that is needed. So I see we also added law enforcement. Yes, law enforcement or the local, you know, police or safety. And I like to think of safety because I want to continue thinking that we are reimagining safety and security. So I'm trying to refrain from using, you know, other words to refer to them. But yes, also think about if your community has direct services providers in terms of psychologists or social workers or counselors, advisors. It would be good to involve them as well. And people don't tend to think about them, but I also think that any administrative staff, even the staff that help us keep our schools and institutions clean, they should be part of this conversation because a lot of times they are way closer to students than other staff are. So they are able to see, you know, some of the suffering, even some of the violence or harm when it is occurring. So it is important to have them be part and have them voice, you know, their concerns in this process because they're also part of that campus community and should be part of that response. And Vicky, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, and I think I would only add one more thing is that for within our tribal campuses, I would expect there would be some form of a cultural program that is representative of the tribe's culture, and having representation from there could be really, really valuable. Again, when we're thinking about sexual violence, the healing process is critical, and it's not just for this one person who has experienced the violence. Healing, as that one person heals, it heals our community. And the work that particular department would do or program or however that's structured within your campus can be really valuable as you look at the kind of response and resources that you can offer within your tribal campus. Next slide. So in this work, we've talked about survivors being in the center of the CCR. And the reason for that is our work is really about how are we going to, well, enhancing the safety is part of it, but I also think about repairing the harm that happens. And as a part of that, any type of changes we do, we need to make sure that it's not going to inadvertently create more harm. And I know I've worked with CCRs over the years, and there's been times that they've had a policy and they think, well, this is really great. And then when we sit down and we really talk about it, we find out it's created an unattended consequence that has a negative impact back to that survivor. And so when we think about being accountable to survivors and centering survivors' experience in the work of the CCR, it's really about making sure that we're not doing any more harm as we're changing policies and protocols and strengthening our response, that we're doing it in a way that's going to strengthen and enhance safety in that process. So it means that we all are committed to the safety of survivors, which is an early part of the process of our CCR. You know, it's great when we invite people, but we really need to engage in work about making sure we're all on the same page, committing to this work, and we understand the potential outcomes that can happen to survivors if we aren't very intentional about and committed to the safety of survivors in the work that we're doing. And as a part of that work, as we come together, we want to recognize and support their autonomy. And as survivors, when I talk about autonomy, they have the ability to make their own decisions. They know what's going to make them safest. They know what they feel about their options that are available for their own health and well-being. And we need to be supporting that. By not supporting their autonomy, we are in fact disempowering them. And when we think about the acts of violence that they may have experienced, that by us disempowering them, we are then reinforcing the violence versus reinforcing safety and well-being and healing. So we want to recognize and support their autonomy. And as we come together as practitioners, one of the things that inevitably comes up is, why can't you tell me what you know about this survivor? And I just cannot stress enough the importance of absolute confidentiality, that this survivor needs to have a space to be able to explore their options without having multiple people know about what they're exploring, what they're asking about. And what oftentimes practitioners don't understand is that this absolute confidentiality is rooted in the safety of the survivor. The safety for that survivor to seek help, the safety of that survivor to process and try to figure out and make sense what happened to them, as well as being able to not have their life shared, particularly in our small tribal communities, without absolute confidentiality. The community will inadvertently end up with a lot more information we would want them to have. So confidentiality is a cornerstone of our work. It holds up what we do, and it really protects that survivor and protects their ability to be autonomous in the process as well. And when we're looking at changing the system, our responses, so when we think about, we're looking at systemic responses that are effective or not effective, that we're working to change the system to enhance safety and protect that survivor while holding offenders accountable. And we are not doing it to change that survivor. People with good intentions will say, well, if we make survivors do this, it'll make them safer. And we're losing the point by trying to make survivors do things. So it goes back to what I was saying about disempowering survivors when we're taking their choice away. So we need to be really clear and centered that we're changing the system and not the survivor. The impact of changing the system is going to have a positive result for that survivor. And so if we change that system in ways that can produce that positive result, we shouldn't have to be trying to control a survivor. And we want to make sure we're including them in our efforts. We can sit there and say, well, I've experienced this violence, 20 years ago, or that was my experience, but it's not the experience of our students. It's not the experience of this population of students. I've been doing this work for 36 years. I came into this work because I had a history of domestic violence and sexual violence that I had experienced. And my experiences from 36 years ago, while there are some things that are still valid today, there is a lot that has changed. So for me to try to influence the system's response based on my experience, we're going to miss a lot that's critically important to our campus and to our student population, to those that are experiencing the violence today. So when we can hear their voices, whether it's our traditional or non-traditional students, our native students and our non-native students, regardless of who that is, we need to be hearing from them to inform our work and guide our work. And through the work that I've done over the years, particularly around CCR, anytime we drafted a protocol or a policy, we always went back to a focus group of survivors. And we said, what do you think of this? How is this helpful for you? How might this harm you? And through those discussions, we learned a ton from them.
Vicky, and if I may add, it is critical to listen to the survivors, and in the context of the CCR team in institutions, in tribal institutions, I also always like to acknowledge that students are, mostly when they're young, we have diverse students, but when they're young, they're also in a transition from their youth to adulthood. So they're also experiencing a lot of different emotions, learning about a new environment, and their reality is very different from a maybe, I don't like to say this word, but it's a different reality to our traditional survivors, where we support them in terms of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, because students are at the intersections of also being a student and also being on one of the hardest critical life transitions that we go as human beings. So I think that's especially important to think about. And in terms of the accountability to survivors, I would also like to add that tribal institutions represent like a microcosmos of a society, a community. So it also replicates some power dynamics, some challenges, some key players that may be so normal as part of that culture of that institution that outsiders or other people with different roles or maybe different privileges or power dynamics may oversee, but that students experience in a different way. And that may bring them closer, or there may be more gaps for them to access services because we may not be fully understanding their reality. So sometimes when with the few tribal colleges that I've worked with, there are small campuses and some of the staff might wear multiple hats. and sometimes some of them are also family members outside, the institution. So how do we think about supporting survivors and showing up in many ways that believe their worth and also provide them with a safe space as it relates to confidentiality, to their own process of making their decisions and not a family member coming in because they have privilege because they're at an institution to protect me and take care of me and maybe with the best interest just reach out to our direct family members and say something else that is not necessarily their place to say. And all of these things happen too in our community and in our family spaces. So I want to say that, tribal institutions and smaller schools, it's not different from what we see in communities and families. And again, recognizing that context is very important when we think about how we set up that response and those services that students need, realizing and recognizing and also being aware of that context and the opportunities that that context provides us, but also with the limitations that it comes and how we work together and creatively to make sure that, we hold accountable, we provide the services that we need, and we also are accountable to providing the quality of those services, the best services that are available to support those students experiencing harm.
Thanks, that was great. Next slide, please. So I do want to just talk briefly about features of a criminal justice systems response. And this comes from a research project that was developed by Mending the Sacred Hoop. And it's from the work of a community-based analysis of the U.S. legal system's intervention in domestic abuse cases involving Indigenous women. And this was a project that was done in Duluth, looking at the criminal justice systems response. And we can see on the left, it shows features of a criminal justice systems response. And it's fragmented, it categorizes people and things in unhelpful ways. Things operate in institutional time and not the same as lived time. So when the system starts to develop a response, it's not timely. So someone who has experienced that violence may want assistance from that criminal justice system right away. And then by the time it actually is in action, it's months may have passed, maybe even a year or two, and people have moved on with their lives. And not to say that the consequences to the offender is still not helpful, but the survivor themselves may feel frustrated with the system because it takes so long. There's no give and take. There's no place for the voice of the survivor to be centered in that response. Yes, there's a place for a victim to give a statement, but it's not able to completely inform that response. And there's no attention to power relationships and how that may impact the survivor in the process. So through that research project, they came up with the Indigenous solutions, which I think is really important when we think about our tribal campus CCR and the work that we're doing. And what we want to do is we want to ensure that our solution is holistic, that we don't fragment the response, and that we ensure that we're treating the entire human being and not just responding to this one incident. Particularly for our tribal communities, we carry multi-generational trauma and historical trauma. And when we're working with current trauma, it's all woven together. So we need to make sure our responses is holistic and recognizing that it's operating in a way that demonstrates respect for women, respect for our relatives, respect for each other. We're honoring our relationships. And what I mean by that is that in that process, then how are we supporting that survivor connected to their relationships and not fragmented away from those relationships as a human being that is connected to other beings, and that we're doing it with integrity and honesty. And when I say that we oftentimes we say, here's our mission statement, these are our values, but are those reflected in our policies and protocols? Are those reflected in our practices and the way that we're operating and doing our work? That our integrity and honesty matches with our plan, our strategies, our practices are all moving forward and matching each other. Next slide. So when we think about 8 activities of a CCR, we have, I've talked about how everybody comes together. We want to have a common language, a common understanding. We're on the same page, a common philosophical approach. So what guides us? And our tribes have our values. I really think about this violence that we're struggling with so much in our communities and across the United States and across the world, that our tribes, because we are still so connected to our Indigenous lifeways, that our values are going to guide us in a lot of ways and take us out of these problems in the next generations. And when we think about it in our CCR work, we want to center our values and our beliefs within that. And we can talk about, when I work with different tribes, we talk about, what's one of the most common values that you have within your tribe. And oftentimes respect is the most frequently stated word, is stated value. But we need to dig deeper. What does respect mean? What does respect mean in this response to our students, to our faculty, to our staff? What does respect mean as a response to sexual assault? What does respect mean when we're operating and developing and putting in place a holistic response to sexual assault? We want to standardize practices in a way that there's a consistency. So, and many people know that times will come up and they'll say, oh yeah, they've got favoritism because of who they are in our community. We want to standardize our practice so that we know that everybody has the same available options to them. It doesn't mean that they are responding to and using the exact same approach, but they have the same options available to them. Resources and services for victims, sanctions for offenders. Bottom line, we want to be undoing harm. And we're doing training. So we're making sure that our staff have training. And when I talk about staff, and Mariacristina mentioned this earlier about the people that are even cleaning within the campus should be involved. Staff that are located in different positions oftentimes can see things and hear things that other staff or faculty may not be aware of. So we want to make sure our training and the evaluation of our training and our efforts are being taken up, but our training is available to everybody. And we monitor and track what's happening. So how is this impacting people? And critically, when we're monitoring and tracking, we don't change our practice for just every little glitch in what happens. We want to make sure themes are emerging. So how are we seeing that this is working effectively for our students, for our faculty and our staff? And is there something where we're seeing that something is not working right and it's happened more than once, to start showing us that there's a theme of a problem here that we can zero in and focus our work on. And then we want to coordinate information and interagency networking. We have a ton of resources, and oftentimes we say we don't, but when we really sit down and start brainstorming the resources, we start to figure out that we really have a lot available. And so that's that coordination and interagency networking, so that we're talking with each other, We're identifying and sharing what we have to offer, and we're building the connections to make that seamless sharing of information and resources available for each other.
Yes, and you know, Vicky, you explained it beautifully. I think that these are just some guidelines to start thinking about what are some activities that tribal institutions could take to start thinking about their CCR teams or their coordinated community response. Um, One of the things that we've also learned in the way is that there's no one way of doing things. Like each one needs to find their own way, their own pace, their own approach to their work. And if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about what could some of those activities be like, or how could it look like for people to know, like, what could be some concrete steps to get this work started. There we go. I think I see a lot of value when we think about starting something, and instead of just, I think there are many ways of gathering and convening people. But I think of this as a relationship, and having coffee and having lunch with people and talking to them about, we have this idea, we would like to accomplish this. This is important because, you know, gender-based violence impacts all of us, and, you know, these are some of the statistics. And as tribal institutions, we're not far away from that. We know that harm may happen and will happen to some of the students. So talking about that, building those connections, and then, you know, having some agreements as to how frequently will you meet, where will you meet, who will convey those meetings, and just assessing, you know, well, what are the needs, where we are as a team and as a group that comes together in terms of understanding what's the response to gender-based violence in our institution. And some people like to talk about what each office brings to the table and what are their services. Some people say, I don't know why I'm here, but then in the way they learn that they bring a lot, that they just weren't making the connection, you know, directly to gender-based violence. For instance, someone that runs, I don't know, housing, but I know tribal institutions, we don't do a lot of housing on campus, but you see, someone that works on health services, like they might not necessarily think that they have something to do with gender-based violence unless there's specific harm that's visible in the body. But then when you think about someone that is unable to sleep due to the trauma and the violence that they experience, it does make sense to bring that healer, to bring that service provider in terms of health, and guide that student to their services, because they need sleep to be well, to study, to function. But we don't tend to make those connections because sometimes we work with the immediate response, with what is very visible from the trauma. So it means that we get to know what each person from the collective group can bring to the table. What are their offerings? What are their available resources? Sometimes it also means that they don't necessarily know about violence, but they're excellent graphic designers, or they can run social media and grab people's attention. So we might work together with them. We can deliver them or give them the content, and they'll do an infographic, or they can help us set up a social media account that can help us listen directly from students what are their needs, because they may use that more than other strategies to communicate. In terms of the assessment phase, I also think that when we think about responding and preventing gender-based violence, we never stop learning. So I think it's always important to have ongoing training, like it says there, education and training. But what do we want to learn about? what is it that is important and relevant to us? Because it might be for some people that they want to learn more about stalking and cyber stalking practices and behaviors and how to document that harm. And it is, important to acknowledge. I'll try to speak louder. I think as I speak, I lose the energy. Thank you, Hanabi, for noticing and sharing. But yes, the work of a team should be guided by its members and what they want to learn, and then what are the areas of work that they want to focus. And based on that, they get trainings and they can partner with a community partner, a technical assistance provider that can come to the institution to deliver some of these trainings. But also team members can make their own research about what are the current best practices. And just bear with me, sometimes best practices are for some people and not for us in our institutions and in our context, but they do provide some helpful guidelines for us to think about and use as a starting point. So just don't disregard them depending on where they come or what they say, but do take them and take them cautiously and make the analysis of how that could relate or not to your community, to your needs. And then work on your policies. And Vicky said this before, like, what is it that we have in written as it relates to responding to dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking? Sometimes we don't have a lot, but it is important to think about this process, to write it together. I say to dream, what would be the best response that we would give a survivor? And that's where, when we talk with them, when we integrate them to the process, like, how does this look like? What would you recommend? What this made you feel? And how you can write that down. How you write that down to serve as a guideline to responding to survivors and to try to be consistent in that report, but not to use that as the only way of supporting someone. Because each case, when we support every individual, each case is unique, and we might need to not break some rules, but follow different directions to best support that person, and that we may not have in written. But if we don't have there, it doesn't mean that we can't support that person. It means that we should always monitor and review and update our policies as needed. And that's something that sometimes we forget. Policies should be a living document that guide our approaches, but they shouldn't be just there always without reviewing. They need to be revisited every once in a while. And each institution decides what's the best pace for them to do that. And then tracking and monitoring. And I think this is also tied with evaluation and revision. Sometimes we do so many things that are heavily focused on processes because that's how we are. Processes are important, the present, where we are. And it might mean that we don't have something to show up for the work that we're doing. Sometimes we can't say how many people attended a conversation, or we can't say how many products we have, or how many people attended a session, or how many trainings have we done. All of that is important, but we need to find our own ways to document that process and to share it with our community, whether that's storytelling, whether that's doing audiovisual products that share and help us distribute and do more outreach to our stories, but that's our way of doing that. And I think that's very important that the tribal institutions stick to that way, stick to that language. Like, you don't need to use the English language to do that storytelling and that narration of what the process looks like, or of what are the values that will guide your work and your approach. because, you know, there's not a way of doing that, but the way of doing that is how it resonates best with you. Like, what makes the most sense to you? What helps you best in terms of the right narrative, the right ritual, the right celebration. So it's very important, like we're sharing all these concepts and all these activities and considerations, but always go back to what is it that you need? What works best? What are the resources that you have within your community and your campus that best respond to what you want to achieve? And that was a lot, so I'll pause. I'm sure Vicky has something good to add.
Wow, and I was just thinking that you just said it beautifully. That was really great. Thank you. Next slide. So just to talk a little bit about the critical work of a CCR, we need to understand how the systems work. So it's not what, you know, I've talked about CCR as a part of a criminal justice systems response, but systems really are the institutions that we all work in. So understanding our tribal, our campus institution as a institution of higher learning, understanding, you know, if we're working with law enforcement, understanding that institution, understanding the healthcare institution where a forensic exam may take place and other medical care, understanding the way our tribe operates within our ceremonies and our values and beliefs, and how our traditional medicines and practices are playing out. So all of these different institutions, although I would say that our tribal lifeways and values and beliefs are not, but we do have protocol in there. We do have things that can and cannot happen as a part of that. And so we want to have an understanding of all of the different institutions that are coming together, as well as a really good working understanding of our tribal college campus as an institution of higher learning. And that's important not just for those that are working on campus, but all of those involved in the CCR. And I mentioned before about some of my early CCR work and how I really had unreasonable expectations of law enforcement. And we're going to have reasonable understandings of each other's work and can make reasonable recommendations and requests of each other the more we learn about each other. And then a process for thinking through unintended consequences. So we want to know how are we going to figure out where there might be a potential backlash or a potential negative outcome or do harm. And so we want to have some kind of a process that we collectively have come to an understanding on. And as a part of that we continue to revisit it and reaffirm our understanding with each other and our process on that. And then we need to have an approach, figure out how we're going to approach a complex problem. And this to me is one of the really critical parts of it, because if we don't have a way to really engage in the complex problems, we're only going to skim the surface. We're not going to make really meaningful, lasting changes. And that ability to approach complex problems sometimes can create tension with each other because we're talking about each other's jobs. And we tend to get protective of our work and of our turf. And I know myself as an advocate, I'm highly protective of our advocacy. And yet I do believe we have room to learn and to grow. And so we need to, you know, recognize that there's going to be times we're going to have tension. How are we going to handle that? And how are we going to talk about the problem? And one of the best things that I've learned over the years is we're looking at creating systemic change. So we're not talking about how George does his job. We're talking about how this how we're organized through policies and protocols, practices, rules, guidances, different things like that that allow us to produce this result. So we're going to change that, and we're not trying to change George. And it becomes easier to focus on these system structure as opposed to the individuals doing the work. And that's important, that we're not sitting there pointing fingers at each other. And when we get into the tension, then how are we going to move past that? And one of the things that my favorite tool is, maybe we need to take a break and step away from it, whether it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or if it's a really big tense situation, maybe we'll revisit it next time or come back tomorrow and revisit it, something like that. But then there's also, as we take a break, then thinking about, you know, what are the questions we can ask to help move us forward, so that we don't stay stuck in tension and have our CCR collapse as a result of that. And also drawing from our tribal ways is that the more we bring in our healing options and prayer and ground it in our values and beliefs and our cultural ways, the less likely we're going to get stuck. I know I was in this was a training and not a CCR meeting, but we were in a training, and the topic was getting really hard. And one of the people in that particular training was from their tribe. And he's like, well, can we take a break? I think we need to do a smudge. So we stopped and we did a group smudge, and we stopped and we had a prayer. And it really helped people deal with some of the hard stuff that was going on for them. And so there's ways we can bring that into our meetings and as part of our structure, and then periodically stop and feast and celebrate your successes as you're moving forward. And we need to be able to address the impacts of oppression. When we look at sexual violence as a problem within our tribal campuses, it's not standing there by itself. It's a part of a system of oppression, as well as it intersects with other types of oppression. So the impact of sexual violence and what happened as a result of that being rooted in misogyny can intersect with racism. It can intersect with ableism. It can intersect with ageism. And all of those can be together in the same place at the same time. So we need to make sure that we're figuring out how to be responsive to that. And one example about the intersection of oppression that I can tell is that through my work with Indian Health Service, that I have heard stories of Native survivor victims of sexual assault seeking forensic exams through mainstream hospitals and being turned away and being told they can only go to the Indian hospital, and that IHS facility may not have had a SANE program. And so how are you going to respond to that? Because sending a survivor out, traveling 2, 3, 4 hours to go get a forensic exam and being turned around is defeating, on top of something that's been horribly disempowering and violent that's occurred to them physically, emotionally, and spiritually. So we need to recognize the impacts of oppression and figure out how we're going to be responsive to that at all the different levels that we're working. Next slide. So 4 tiers of accountability. And I think I've talked a lot about offender accountability, so I'm gonna move on from that. But there's a systemic accountability to the victims. And when I say systemic accountability, it's the institutional accountability to that victim. And sometimes that institution doesn't quite function as well as we would like it to, and it creates harm. So the example that I just gave about a survivor being turned away at a medical facility, that system, that medical facility was failing that adult victim. And as a result of that, maybe some of those survivors never did finish and get connected to a forensic exam as a result of being turned away. And it does harm. So we need to figure out, how are we accountable to that victim, and institutionally making sure that we're being accountable in a way that we're providing the best to that victim and not the worst that we can provide. We want to provide the best. And we're accountability with each other. So as we sit together at the tables, there's a mutual accountability that we have amongst our peers, that if I am doing my work as an advocate and law enforcement doesn't show up to take a report from this survivor, or it ends up taking a few days to show up for that, then there's something kind of dropping there. Same thing if the hospital calls an advocate out and the advocate doesn't show up, or the advocate comes and the advocate's ill-prepared, that other institution is failing. And so we need as peers to make sure we're showing up and doing our best. And then as we're working at the table together, trying to change policies and practices and all of what we're working on through our CCR, we need to come fully prepared to engage, participate, stay present, and work through the tension that may arise. And try not to get our feelings hurt, because this isn't about me as an advocate. This is about how our advocacy can better serve this survivor. It's about how, it's not about that law enforcement officer. It's about how that law enforcement department can better serve that survivor. And we could do that with all practitioners. So we want to make sure that we come prepared to work together in a really solid way. And it's agency to agency. And sometimes, and I know as an advocate, when an advocate goes and challenges a prosecutor, then there's tension between the two agencies. Well, we got to work that stuff out so we can be effective, because we're here for the survivors and not because of ourselves. Next slide. So our challenges of a CCR, and we have covered all of this. As we're getting to the end here, just really wanting to come back kind of to summarize it, that we're keeping a focus on victim safety. That is central to our work. Every action we take, we need to be asking the question, how is this going to impact this victim? How is this going to enhance this survivor safety? And we're maintaining trust and information exchange between agencies. And when we work together, if there's an agency sitting at the table and they're disclosing something that's not working well in their agency, I need to keep my mouth shut and not blab it all over the community. I need to respect that they're working on this and give them the privacy and the space to work through it at our table to collectively together. And that's trust. That's a trust that they're providing, that they're putting in me as one of the members of the CCR. And we want to have mutual trust of each other. And that's something we earn from our practices with each other. And we're sharing and exchanging information between agencies to support and enhance each other's work. And we're revisiting policies and procedures. And we're using interagency working groups. So I would not want to sit down and review all of our advocacy policies in terms of how we work with these different agencies without involving the other agencies with that. I want to make sure if I'm working with law enforcement, if I'm working with prosecutor, if I'm working with a forensic examiner, if I'm working with the Title IX coordinator, and we're making policies that have a potential impact, they need to be sitting at the table as well, and helping to inform that, to shape it, and to define it. And then we're holding each other accountable while maintaining effective working relationships. And one elder has taught me that in the work that we do, when we do accountability, we do it with the most love and respect. And we remember our relatives. And so there's people talk about brutal honesty. And I believe that is not respect. That is not showing love and respect. You can be direct, you can be honest, and you can carry that message with love and respect, with a gentleness and a kindness, so that people can hear you and not want to shut down because it hurts. So we want to hold each other accountable while we're centering love and respect, recognizing we are each relatives, working for a common good, a common outcome, trying to heal our communities and to make things better for survivors while holding offenders accountable and each other accountable in this work. Next slide. Maria, would you like to say something?
No, I think, you know, as a closeout, people may find other challenges along their way. And I think that brings us to this next slide about resources, is that you don't have to do this work alone, that there's a lot of institutions that are already doing the work that are more than happy to sit down with you and support you in this process. There are organizations, technical assistance providers, online resources with some products that may serve you as a guide on this process. And the value of this is that if there's something that we don't know about, we sit down together and discuss it and find ways to support one another. And, you know, any process or any decision that you make as an institution to start working on this, it's good as long as it is yours and you own it and everyone's involved and committed to this process. That it's a long road, but it's very rewarding as well when you see, you know, the responses and the changes that sometimes are slower than what we want, but that you'll see them once you start doing this work.
Thanks. I do want to point out one of these resources that a lot of people may not be aware of, and that's our tribal coalitions, the resource listed in the middle. So there are tribal coalitions across the United States that are focusing on addressing both domestic and sexual violence. And as a coalition, they're working in a regional level. Some of them are statewide, some of them are serving just a region of tribes. And they're a great resource for those that are developing programming as well as needing training, because they provide training, they provide support and the different kind of resources. They work with the advocacy programs within the tribes that they serve. So say, for instance, in Arizona, the Southwest Indigenous Women's Coalition serves the 22 tribes in Arizona. The Great Plains Society is a coalition in South Dakota, and they serve the tribes in that state. So there's several tribal coalitions, so please check that out. That's a website for OVW, the Office on Violence Against Women. And when you go in there, you can see the list. It'll show state coalitions, but in there you'll also see a column where it shows the tribal coalitions. And so look to see if there's a tribal coalition serving your tribe. And then the other thing I do want to do is a shout out to Red Wind. We provide TA to tribal colleges and universities. And our website is that first bullet, thetribalcampus.org. And if you want assistance with direct training or guidance and support, help with some policy development, different kinds of things like that, give a call to us. It's a grant. We're funded through grants from the Office on Violence Against Women. So there are no charge for our services. And, you know, we can work at a distance. We can also do site visits once the pandemic lets us move around again. So reach out to our website as well. And there's a place to request contact from us, and we'll respond within a couple days. And we're at the end. So I guess to just pause to see if there's any questions for us before we shut down for today.
Once again, if you have any questions, you can either put them into the chat or you can click the little hand icon and we will be able to see that.
And while we're waiting on that, I just want to thank you folks for being here, joining us. I've always enjoyed talking about this work, and I think it's one of the best tools that we have for creating really great change. within our tribal communities. And, you know, I'm an older woman, so I'm going to say this and you'll know it's dated. I think it's the best thing since sliced bread. It's a little corny, but, and I'm not seeing any questions come up. So with that, Hanovi, we'll turn it back to you.
Alrighty, thank you, Vicki. Before we end the session, I want to let you all know that there will be an eval popping up once Zoom closes. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you are able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be uploaded onto Redmond's YouTube channel within a few days. You can also find previous recordings there. And in closing, I'd like to thank our presenters, I'd like to thank our captioner, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to see you all at the next webinar.